All right, let's get right into it. We're going back in time to talk about an event that didn't just tweak a few borders. No, it completely redrew the map of the entire world. It basically set the stage for the whole 20th century. We're talking, of course, about the First World War.
So here's the big question, right? How did a single assassination, just one, kick off a world war? I mean, it sounds like something out of a thriller, but it's 100% real history. The murder of a royal couple in a city most people had probably never even heard of, and somehow that sparks a global conflict that ends up killing millions of people? It seems impossible, but that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
So to really get how this explosion happened, you have to understand that the pressure had been building up for years. Seriously. The world didn't just stumble and fall into war. It was more like it was walking on a knife's edge for a long time before any shots were even fired.
So, try to picture this. It's the early 1900s. Europe is, well, it's on top of the world. You've got these massive empires stretching all across the globe. Incredible new industrial tech is changing everything, and the sense of national pride is just soaring. But, and this is a big but, just underneath that shiny surface, there was this really dangerous competition simmering away. Everybody wanted more land, more colonies, and of course, a bigger, badder military.
And this rivalry basically split the entire continent into two huge armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance. That's the powerful German Empire, really worried about a two-front war, teamed up with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then on the other side, you had the Triple Entente. That was France, looking for some backup against Germany, joining forces with the massive Russian Empire and the United Kingdom. Now here's the crazy part. These alliances were supposed to keep the peace, but what they actually did was create this hair-trigger situation where if one country got into a fight, everybody got dragged in.
And the absolute flashpoint for all this tension, it was a region called the Balkans. It was so volatile, people literally called it the powder keg of Europe. And for good reason. You had all this intense nationalism, all these ethnic conflicts just boiling over. It was a mess just waiting for a spark to set the whole thing off.
And, well, that spark was about to be lit. We're going to zoom in now from the big picture politics to the single fateful event, the very human moment that acted as the catalyst for this global catastrophe.
All right, let's set the scene. The date is June 28th, 1914. The place? Sarajevo. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a guy named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie are in town for a royal visit. But as you can probably guess, not everyone was happy to see them.
See, a group of Serbian nationalists who believed the region really should belong to Serbia had a plan. As the Archduke's motorcade is driving along, the first assassination attempt happens. Someone throws a bomb, but it fails. It causes total chaos. But the Archduke and his wife, they're unharmed. For now.
And this is one of those moments where history just pivots on a dime, on pure dumb luck. The royal couple decides to continue their visit. They get back in the car, but a little later their driver takes a wrong turn, and he has to stop the vehicle to reverse right in front of a small cafe.
And who just happens to be standing right there, probably thinking his chance was blown. One of the assassins, Gabrielo Princip. He cannot believe his luck. It's an unbelievable second chance. He steps forward, pulls out his pistol, and fires 2 shots. One hit the Archduke, the other hit his wife. And just like that, they were both dead within minutes.
So those 2 gunshots, that was the spark. The powder keg of Europe had finally been ignited. And what happened next was this horrifying, unstoppable chain reaction. Let's watch how the dominoes fell.
This is that alliance trap I was talking about. In action. It's just wild. First, Austria-Hungary blames Serbia for the assassination and declares war. In response, Russia, Serbia's powerful ally, starts mobilizing its army. Well, that spooks Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, which then declares war on Russia and its ally, France. Finally, to get to France, Germany just marches through neutral Belgium. And that single act brings the British Empire into the war. One after another, the dominoes fell in just a few weeks.
And the conflict didn't stop at Europe's borders. I mean, this thing escalated at a terrifying pace. That regional dispute, sparked by 2 gunshots, would eventually pull in more than 30 nations from all over the globe, becoming a true world war.
So, as millions of young men are marching off to the front lines, they're cheering, they're excited, but they're carrying with them this profound, and I mean deeply tragic misunderstanding about what they were actually getting into.
You have to understand, this was the common belief on all sides.
Soldiers were cheering, civilians were celebrating in the streets. They thought this was going to be a short, glorious adventure. A quick victory, and everyone would be home with their families by Christmas. They couldn't have been more wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. The war they expected to be over in months would instead drag on for 4 of the most brutal years in human history, and it would fundamentally change the world forever. And this leaves us with this final, just haunting question. It wasn't just a failure of diplomacy, it was a complete failure of imagination. How could an entire generation, so proud of its progress and power, get it so catastrophically wrong? It's a chilling reminder of how quickly a world on edge can be plunged right into darkness.
World War I. They called it the Great War. Sounds almost noble, doesn't it? But what it actually was, well, it was a conflict that completely redrew the map of the world and introduced a scale of destruction humanity had literally never seen before. So let's get into it. Let's really try and understand how this war became the defining catastrophe of the 20th century. So you gotta picture this. By late 1914, just a few months in, the whole thing just stopped. The massive armies on the Western Front completely ground to a halt. All those grand plans for a quick, glorious war, yeah, they were dead in the water. And what replaced them was, well, it was something way, way more horrifying. And that really brings us to the big question we're tackling here. How on earth did a conflict that started in Europe spiral into this global catastrophe of mud and machines? We're going to break it down. We'll look at how the trenches created this insane deadlock, how new technology made the killing almost factory-like in its efficiency, and how this thing just kept spreading, way beyond the fields of France and Belgium. All right, so to really wrap our heads around this, we have to start small. We have to get right down on the ground, in the mud. We're going to zoom right into the trenches themselves to see, what actually created this stalemate and what life was like for the millions of soldiers who were trapped in it. Okay, so what was the stalemate? It was actually a pretty simple but absolutely brutal formula. First, you've got hundreds of kilometers of trenches. Then, you protect those trenches with huge thickets of barbed wire. And then, you have machine guns covering every inch of that wire. And just for good measure, you've got artillery pounding everything from miles away. It was, honestly, a near-perfect defensive system. Trying to attack it, it was basically a suicide mission. And that terrifying space between the two enemy trench lines, it had a name, No Man's Land. And it was exactly what it sounds like. It wasn't for anyone. If you tried to cross it, you were just walking into a hail of machine gun fire. It just turned the whole landscape into this blasted, crater-pocked wasteland of death. And if you think being outside the trench was bad, living inside it was its own kind of hell. We're talking about living 24/7 in mud and filth. Disease was just rampant. Huge, bloated rats were everywhere. And on top of all of that, you had the constant, mind-shattering sound of shells exploding. There was just no escape from it. And all of that constant terror, it just breaks a person. It took an incredible mental toll. And this is really where we start to see the first widespread recognition of what they called shell shock. A deep, deep psychological trauma that would just haunt these soldiers for the rest of their lives. The human mind just wasn't built to take that kind of punishment. And this really sums up the absolute futility of the whole situation. For all the fighting, all the dying, the front lines barely moved. So the whole war just became this brutal, grinding war of attrition. The strategy, if you can even call it that, was basically just to kill more of their guys than they killed of yours and hope they ran out of men first. It's just grim. Let's try and put some numbers on this because it's hard to grasp. Take the Battle of Verdun, just one battle. It went on for 10 months. And in that one battle, there were over 700,000 casualties. Just let that sink in. Nearly 750,000 men killed, wounded, missing. And for what? For basically no strategic gain at all. And if you think that number is unbelievable, just look at this one. The Battle of the Somme. We're not talking about 10 months here. We're talking about the very first day. On day 1, the British Army lost nearly 60,000 men. 60,000 casualties in a single day. That is more people than can fit in most Major League Baseball stadiums. Gone in 24 hours. So you can see the problem, right? You're trapped in this deadlock, losing men at an insane rate. Something has to give. Both sides were absolutely desperate to break through. And their answer? It wasn't some brilliant new strategy. No, it was technology. Deadlier tools. And that's where we're going next. Okay, so let's talk about the hardware, the machines of war, because that's really what World War I was. It was the world's first truly industrial war. You had these generals using 19th century tactics, lining up and charging the enemy, but they were running straight into 20th century weapons. It was a perfect storm for absolute slaughter. And this really gives you a sense of the new arsenal. I mean, you've got machine guns, obviously. Heavy artillery that could just pulverize the landscape. But then you have these terrifying new things. Poison gas, the first tanks. And the war wasn't just on land anymore. Suddenly you have battles happening in the sky and deep under the sea. But, and this is the really tragic irony of the whole thing, every single one of these new technologies, every invention that was supposed to finally break the stalemate, it just made things worse. The intention was to win, but the result was just unprecedented destruction. The goal was to gain an advantage, but it just led to everyone digging in deeper. They wanted to protect soldiers, but instead they just invented new and more horrible ways for them to suffer. So let's break a few of these down. You had poison gas, just these terrifying, choking clouds that would drift over no man's land. It meant everyone had to wear these awful, claustrophobic gas masks. Then you get the first tanks, these slow, clunky, armored beasts designed to just crawl across the battlefield and crush the barbed wire. Up in the sky, airplanes weren't just for scouting anymore. Now you have pilots in dogfights, actual combat in the air. And under the water, German U-boats were silently hunting enemy ships, completely changing the game at sea. So what's the big takeaway here? It's pretty simple and pretty grim. All that industrial power that had built the modern world, the factories, the railroads, it was now being used for one thing: mass slaughter. The battlefields weren't battlefields anymore. They had become killing fields, basically factory assembly lines for death. But here's the thing. All of this horror we've been talking about, it wasn't just happening in France and Belgium, not even close. So now we need to pull the camera back, way back, to see how this became a world war, the first one in history. Suddenly, fighting just erupts all over the globe. The British and French empires are fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, which leads to the infamous and disastrous campaign at Gallipoli. You've got Arab fighters in the desert rising up against the Ottomans with help from the British. And this is so important. The empires pulled in troops from all over the world. Millions of soldiers from Africa, from India, from all across Asia were shipped thousands of miles away to fight and die for their colonial rulers. And this chart does a pretty good job of showing that. Yeah, the Western Front was the horrifying main event, the part we all remember. But look at these other fronts. There were massive theaters of war raging all over the planet. This was never just a European squabble. It was a full-blown conflict of global empires fighting for control everywhere. So there you have it. We've gone from the hellish, claustrophobic view of a single soldier in a single trench all the way out to a view of an entire planet at war. The scale of this thing was just unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, in terms of geography, in terms of technology, and most of all in the absolutely mind-boggling human cost. And that brings us to the final, haunting question. After all that, after the entire world saw its first industrial war, after millions of people were fed into this machine, what lessons did we actually learn, if any? It's a question that becomes even more chilling when you remember that just 20 years later, the world would do it all over again, but even bigger.
Let's dive into one of history's biggest, most tragic ironies. We're talking about how the war that was supposed to end all wars actually just paved the way for something way, way worse. So how did the promise of peace in 1918 lead straight to another world war just 20 years down the road?
You see, the guns fell silent. An armistice was signed. And on paper, yeah, the Great War was over. But the real question, the one that would haunt the world for the next 2 decades, was this. Did the war really, truly end? Or did it just, change its form? That's the question we're tackling today.
For 3 unbelievably long years, World War I was just a total meat grinder, a brutal, bloody stalemate where millions died for a few inches of mud. But all this time, across the Atlantic, a sleeping giant had stayed out of it, and its entry was about to change absolutely everything.
So what was it that finally dragged the U.S. into the fight?
Well, it was this rapid-fire series of events. First, you had German U-boats sinking ships in the Atlantic, and some of those ships had Americans on board. Then, and this was the real bombshell, the Zimmermann telegram. It was a secret message from Germany to Mexico, basically saying, hey, how about you ally with us against the United States? The public outrage was explosive, and by April 1917, that was it. America was officially at war.
And just think about the impact of that for a second. For years, this war was a battle of sheer exhaustion. But now, all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of fresh, well-equipped American soldiers started pouring onto the Western Front. The scales were tipping, big time. The deadlock was about to be broken.
But here's the thing. America's entry wasn't the only story. While all these new troops were showing up, the great empires of the Central Powers were starting to rot from the inside out.
And the collapse, wow, it was stunningly fast. In Russia, you have a massive revolution that topples the entire monarchy, and the new government just pulls right out of the war. Germany was being crippled by severe food shortages, and there was unrest in the streets. The huge, multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was literally fracturing as different groups started demanding their own countries. And the Ottoman Empire was finally crumbling after years and years of military pressure. This internal decay, it was really the final blow. I mean, they were facing total collapse at home and this overwhelming new force on the battlefield. The Central Powers, they just had no choice. The war was coming to a very rapid end.
And so, after 4 incredibly long years, the moment the entire world had been waiting for finally arrived. The fighting was about to stop, and with it came this fragile, desperate hope for a new beginning.
Can you just imagine that moment? Germany signs the armistice, and it is specific, prearranged time, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the constant, deafening roar of artillery, the sound that had defined life and death for 4 years, it just stopped. Complete silence.
But that silence was haunted. It was haunted by this number. Over 16 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. An entire generation had been lost, cities were in ruins, and the world was just completely forever changed by the sheer scale of the slaughter.
And yet, in the middle of all this devastation, this incredibly powerful idea started to take hold. That this conflict was so horrific, so absolute, that it had to be the last one. It must be the war to end all wars. It was a beautiful, hopeful idea, but would turn out to be so tragically wrong.
So, in 1919, the victorious leaders all gathered in France to hammer out the terms of the peace. Their goal was to build a brand new world, but the document they created, the Treaty of Versailles, would go down as one of the most controversial in all of history.
The treaty they handed to Germany wasn't about, healing and reconciliation. It was about punishment. Germany was stripped of its territory. Its military was basically dismantled, and it was hit with these crippling financial payments called reparations. But the deepest cut of all, the one that really stung, was the war guilt clause. It forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for starting a war that had engulfed the entire planet.
For the German people, this wasn't a treaty. They called it a diktat, a dictated peace. It was seen as a national humiliation, something that was both profoundly unfair and totally impossible to fulfill. And that feeling of resentment, it wasn't just going to go away. It would sit there and fester, poisoning German politics for years and years.
So, okay, the war is over, the treaty is signed, but the peace that followed was built on some incredibly shaky ground. This new world order was fragile right from day one. Now, a key part of this new world was supposed to be the League of Nations. And on paper, it's a brilliant idea, right? A global group to talk through disputes and prevent wars. But in reality, it had a fatal flaw. It had no real power. It was all talk. It could condemn a country for being aggressive, but it couldn't actually do anything to stop them. And just look at the sheer scale of the change. Before 1914, you had 4 massive empires controlling huge chunks of the map. By 1919, poof, they were gone. And in their place, you get this patchwork of new, often pretty unstable nations. The entire political DNA of Europe and the Middle East was completely rewritten. And this, right here, is the ultimate takeaway. You take that German resentment, you add the weakness of the League of Nations, and you mix in the instability of this new world map, and you have a perfect storm. The peace wasn't really peace at all. It was just a 20-year pause.